This is Jim Purcell.
And I'm Stephen Van Yoder. We're the co-founders of the Returns On Wellbeing Institute and co-hosts of today's interview with David Friedman.
Workplace cultures comprise the values and everyday behaviors that guide how management and employees make decisions and conduct themselves in the workplace. When cultures support employee health and well-being, it leads to higher employee engagement, better workplace performance, and it helps companies succeed. But when workplace cultures do not support workplace well-being, employee health and productivity diminish, along with employer profits.
Our guest David Friedman asserts that effective workplace cultures are why top companies succeed. Cultures are more than ethereal concepts. They're increasingly how successful companies differentiate from competitors and avoid commoditization. But effective cultures rarely happen by chance. They are intentionally designed to advance core business objectives, and they enhance employee well-being by providing fulfilling work environments where people and companies can realize their full potential.
David's company, High Performing Cultures, has helped over 6,000 employees to take steps, 6,000 CEOs to take steps to optimize their business cultures. He's also the author of several books, including his most recent Culture by Design, that shows how to create strong workplace cultures that drive business success. David, it's good to have you with us here today.
Thanks, Jim and Steve. It's great to be with you.
Let's start by defining what an ideal workplace culture looks like, the kind of culture that delivers strong, sustainable business outcomes. Can you describe this in some real detail and why it's a key to success today?
To me, Jim, culture is the way things happen in a company. And so often when people talk about culture, it gets very fluffy and it gets very amorphous and very nebulous. And I look at culture through the lens of behaviors. What are the behaviors that people in the organization are doing every day? That's really what the culture is all about. Now, my point of view about that is that given how important culture is, and I know we're going to talk about this, how it influences everything that takes place in the organization, leaders ought to be intentional, and you referred to it, Stephen, that leaders ought to be intentional about how they create their culture instead of just hoping that somehow it's going to work out on its own. Because by the way, if a leader isn't intentional about creating the culture that they want, it's going to get created anyway. And it's not like the culture doesn't happen, it happens. And it mostly happens, I would tell you, influenced by strongest personalities in the company. And we've all seen, so to go to your question about what makes a really good culture, we've all seen organizations that have thriving cultures where people are engaged and they're excited and they're motivated and they're working together as teams and they're checking their egos at the door and they're productive. And we've all seen cultures that are the opposite of that. And my experience is that if we don't purposely create the first of those, that again, it's going to happen anyway. We're going to have a culture, but it's going to mostly be influenced by the strongest personalities in the organization. And sometimes those strongest personalities are really positive, enthusiastic, hardworking, quality-oriented kind of people. And sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're, pardon the language, but sometimes they're cynical jerks with lousy attitudes who are, backbiting each other and destroying the company, and they're only worried about themselves, and there's negative competition and all the other kinds of negative things that happen. And if we just allow it to happen however it happens in a sort of organic way, we run the risk of that taking place. And given how important culture is, my overall point of view is, gosh, given how important that is, why would I leave that to chance? I have to be purposeful about it.
One of the things we're going to talk about is how you have made culture understandable and practical for CEOs who otherwise would say culture, it's kind of amorphous, it's weird, sounds like anthropology 101. But yet, why is culture so important to success of a business? Why is it? Why is it the key?
Well, so here's what I would say, Jim. There are a number of reasons, but the first thing I would say is that the culture in any organization, and I would expand this beyond even business. I know we're talking about business, but any group of human beings, whether it's a group of friends or whether it's a sports team or whether it's a classroom or a family, that in any group of people, the culture has an enormous influence over everything that people do. In a business setting, it affects our ability to attract and retain the kind of people that we want to attract and retain. It affects how how employees deal with customers. It affects how well they work together. I mean, there's a famous quote from Peter Drucker that everybody's heard, where Peter Drucker once said that culture eats strategy for breakfast, or I think I've heard it lunch too. I'm not sure what meal he was talking about, but when he says that, the essence of what he's saying is you could have the most strategy in the world, you could have wonderful product. If you've got a screwed up dysfunctional group of people and how they work together or don't, you're not going to get very far. I don't care how brilliant the strategy may be. Most businesses today exist in fairly commoditized environments where whatever it is that we say makes us special, whatever our product or service is, rarely is it all that unique. That, you know, I do this, I do lots of talks to groups, and sometimes if it's in a small setting, I'll ask people to introduce themselves, and I'll ask them, tell me about your primary competitive advantage. Like, why, if I was a customer, a potential customer, why would I buy from you instead of anyone else who sells whatever you do? And as people tell me their advantage, they say things that are not very distinctive. Oh, we really care about our customers. Like, your competitors don't care about their customers. Or we've been in business for 67 years. So why do I care? What does that do for me? That, you know, they say all these things that they think are special that aren't. And so we're all in this environment where whatever we offer, everybody else offers basically the same thing. And in that kind of a commoditized environment, the only way that customers have to choose basically is price. And none of us want to be in that kind of market. But if we could somehow get our people to be better than our competitors' people in how they work together and how they work with customers and how they innovate and how they do everything, I would argue that not only is that the biggest competitive advantage you could create in this commoditized environment, but I would argue it's also the most sustainable competitive advantage.
You've defined culture as I'm quoting, the commonly held set of values and principles that show up in everyday behaviors of your people. Now, talk about what that means, the everyday values and behaviors, and maybe how that affects life inside the company for employees and what your customers and clients perceive outside the company.
Let's start with inside the company. So when I say it's the commonly held set of values and principles, when I say commonly held, so the culture isn't necessarily what the CEO said it is. It might be, but it isn't necessarily. And it isn't necessarily the signs that they put on the walls with their vision, mission, and values, or what they put on their website. I make a very big deal about the difference between values and behaviors. And this is a really important point for people. A value to me is an abstract idea: quality, integrity, innovation, teamwork, service, respect, etc. Behaviors are actions. They're things you can see people doing. So some of the behaviors that I teach in our organization and many of our clients are things like honor commitments, practice blameless problem solving, get clear on expectations, be a fanatic about response time. These are actions. So behaviors are actions where values are abstract ideas. The reason this distinction is actually important for your listeners is that the problem with the way you mostly see companies talk about their core values is they look wonderful on the wall, but they're so abstract that they're really hard to operationalize. They're hard to make concrete. Behaviors, though, because they're a lot more action-oriented, are a lot easier to teach and coach and guide and give people feedback about. When we see culture through a behavior lens, it enables us to actually do something about this, because what I teach basically is a behavior modification model, that we know how to change behavior. It's very hard to change values. We can change behavior. So when we see culture through a behavior lens and we can define the culture through the behaviors that we want to see going on in our organization, now we have a chance to really teach that stuff and actually make it happen, have some impact. So ultimately, the behaviors that are going on in the company every day on the inside are really what that culture is. Now, the way that relates to the external is a couple things. First of all, obviously the way that, if I'm in my company, the way that I'm relating affects how I think about customers, how I deal with customers, et cetera. But it also affects ultimately what is often called our brand promise. When we think about the external brand, who are we to the marketplace? What are we representing to the marketplace? There's a brand promise that we're making. We're saying to the market that this is what you're going to get when you work with us. So ultimately, it's the behaviors that people are doing that affect how they work internally, but also affect how we ultimately deliver upon the brand promise we're making out into the world.
Increasingly, too, potential employees are more empowered to learn about what happens inside your company than they were 10 years ago. If people don't like the culture, they go out and they post it somewhere and they're going to learn. You can lose a lot of good potential employees and never know that it happened.
I think you make a good point. I mean, with Glassdoor and other kinds of sites, that stuff used to be hidden, but we're so much more transparent about that stuff. And so when we talk about marketing, I think you make a good point. It isn't only marketing to customers or potential customers, it's marketing to potential employees too, as we try to build a great workforce.
If you could talk about how your model works, and more to the point, how employers tie your model to their core strategic business objectives that are specific to their own organizations. I mean, we understand all this is the right thing to do, and it's the way to run a company, but it's also about driving core strategic business objectives. So you have a process, but how is that process tied to specific core objectives of specific companies?
To me, if you understand how important culture is, then as a leader, you ought to be systematic and intentional about it. And you ought to be as systematic about your culture as you are about your finances or your operations or your sales or other aspects of your company. This is not the fluff. It's a business process, and you should look at it like a business process. So I organize the steps that it takes to do that around a framework that I call the 8-step framework. 8 different things. You do these 8 things. This is how you take a real process view of building and driving the culture that you want. And while all of the 8 steps are important, there are really 2 of the steps. And those 2 things are, first, how we go about defining, well, what is the culture we're trying to create in the first place? Because if we don't define that with enough clarity, how the heck are we going to be able to create it? If we could get our people doing these behaviors, this would help us achieve the objectives that we say are important to us. This is our strategy. This is what we are in the marketplace. And if we could get our employees to do these behaviors consistently, wow, we're going to be incredibly successful. So often what you see in companies are these very lofty, nebulous, wonderful sounding values. But all right, well, how does that translate to what I do every day at work? It doesn't. And by the way, I give those behaviors a name. It's just my own name. I call them fundamentals because I think they're fundamental to success. And the key to that is a very simple and yet powerful concept that I call creating rituals, which is the second step in this 8-step framework I was referring to. A ritual is some routine, some habit. And the reason that rituals are so important to success in any endeavor, culture or otherwise, most people are not very good at sticking with things. So the way we use that concept is we take these fundamentals, as I call them, they get rolled out into the organization in highly interactive, engaged sessions, and then we begin to focus on one fundamental each week through a series of rituals. So here's a really simple one that I do in my company and pretty much all of our clients. Every time we have a meeting in our company of any sort, whether it's a virtual meeting, whether it's in person, whether it's a management meeting, a sales meeting, if there's a meeting going on in my company this week, every single one of those meetings, the first agenda item of the meeting is the fundamental of the week. So the idea is, if we can define these behaviors that help us to drive that strategy, and then we can create a structured, systematic way to teach those behaviors over and over and over and over and over and over again, sooner or later, those behaviors just become internalized in our people.
To help viewers get a more concrete view of your process, can you talk about a company who's gone through this? And you don't necessarily need to name the company, but could you tell us how they started, their process, their timeline, how it's performed now that their new culture is established? Put it on the ground for, so to speak.
Sure. So we've done hundreds and hundreds of these, and I'll make a slight tweak to your question or your statement. And that
right?
is that when you say that, how their new culture is performed, often it isn't necessarily new. It's just a codification of what they've already been doing. So many times they've been doing good things. It's just so informal and it's not structured and not as consistent and it's not as systematic. So it's not that they were, in most cases, it's not that they were some dysfunctional, screwed up company and now all of a sudden, they got religion and now it's, dramatically changed. Often it's companies that are pretty good, but they're not that consistent or systematic. And as they grow, how do we make sure we maintain these things that we've always believed in, but haven't had a way to practice? And I'll give you more detail about this, but to add one more element to this, often it's the case, my experience is that when companies are smaller and they're starting, their culture is mostly person-centered. And what I mean by that is there's a dynamic leader and he or she set the tone.
Mm-hmm.
And just by their sheer physical presence and example, people kind of picked up the vibe and they said, be like Jim or be like Steve. And that was good enough. And okay, that was kind of the culture. But there was nothing more formal than that.
Yeah.
And that was okay when they only had 10 or 15 or 20 people. But when they had 100 or 200 or 500, or they made an acquisition or two, or they now have the locations, not everybody's seeing Jim or Steve anymore. And so we can't rely on that to be the culture. And so we help them to codify Jimness or Stevenness and identify what that is, articulate that, and then create the systems to drive that everywhere in the organization so we never lose it. So having said that, let me answer your question. So to give you some examples. I'll give you an example. So here's a company that we did actually take from not so good to being great. So I'm thinking about a company in the Atlanta area that manages properties, apartment complexes. And the CEO said to me, he was frustrated. He talks about this all the time. There's actually a video of him on our website, that he reached a point where the culture ran away from him. When it was small, it was easy. And then it just, more and more people got added and he lost control over it because some of those negative personalities who creeped into the organization and were stronger personalities influenced people around them. And the CEO said to me, I don't even like coming into work anymore. In fact, I'm thinking of selling the company because it's just miserable. I don't even want to be here anymore. And that wasn't the vision he had when he started the company. So we worked with his team to identify, well, what would it look like? What would the behaviors be? You would say, wow, man, I love coming to work. This is a fantastic company. We're being more successful. And so we articulated their fundamentals. We rolled them out in interactive, engaged sessions, and then began practicing them every week. Today, that CEO says it's like night and day. He loves coming to work. He's happy again.
We base our premises on data from Gallup, Deloitte, on and on and on, that increasingly are proving that employee well-being, particularly their physical, mental, and financial well-being, is really key to getting your people to bring their best selves to work and doing their best on the job. And culture is centered, especially we think, around stress, mental health, and that is for the better or worse. Where do you see employee well-being fitting in your model as far as the role of culture in supporting well-being and where companies need to pay attention if they may be falling short?
Let's picture two different people. One person on Sunday night is thinking, oh, I got that pit in my stomach. I'm nervous. I'm uncomfortable. I don't want to go to work. And another person is excited that, hey, it's Monday tomorrow. We got a lot of fun things going on. I'm looking forward to being with the people I work with. I love the things I do. If you had a whole bunch of the first people or a whole bunch of the second people,
right,
which one's going to be a lot more productive? Obviously, the second one. You're going to have less stress. You're going to be happier. You're going to sleep better. You're going to be healthier. You're going to be more motivated. And if you feel all of those things, it has to translate to better performance. When you call a company, you can tell right on the phone whether the employee's happy or not. A happy employee sounds different on the phone than a miserable employee. Someone who can't stand their teammates, hates their work, hates their boss, feels unappreciated. All of those things translate into their performance and how productive they are, how innovative they are, even safety. Think about companies that are in construction and
Right.
manufacturing fields where safety is so critical. There's no way employees are going to work as safely if they hate their job. And conversely, if they feel like we're a family and we all care about each other and we support each other, we're going to work more safely. It just affects every aspect of what people do.
Many cultures fail to achieve optimal results due to their frontline managers not being fully on board. This is especially true for those managers who focus on hitting their numbers regardless of the impact on their direct reports' health and well-being. And that can lead to high turnover, low employee engagement, and really lousy customer service. So tell us, how do companies ensure that managers support their chosen cultures, and what should happen when they don't?
Well, it all, Jim, comes down to teaching. And it's why when we articulate the fundamentals that are important, and the fundamentals that are important aren't different for managers than they are for employees. If we're all living to this common set of behaviors, that this is how we operate in our company, we just deal with things differently. And so we teach managers how to deal with things differently. When I hear managers and supervisors talk, it's interesting. I'm a big believer in the power of language, and I think the word choice that people use is reflective of how they think. And sometimes I'll hear a manager talk about how many people work for me, and that's always like a red flag to me, because I think the ideal manager looks at it and says, I work for my team, not the other way around. My job as a manager or leader is to help my team to be successful. That they're the ones who are doing the real work in the company. My job is to do everything I can to support them to be able to do their job as successfully as they can possibly do. So I work for them, not the other way around. Let me give you a really simple example. One of the fundamentals, I referred to it earlier, that's in my own company and virtually every one of our clients, is one that we call practice blameless problem solving. And when we have all this blame in an organization, it causes people to be defensive. It causes people to cover up mistakes because I don't want to point them out. It stifles innovation. It does all kinds of lousy stuff. If we can teach people, managers and everyone, not just managers, but everybody, that we don't do that here. That when a problem happens, we say, oh, okay, well, that happened. Let's fix it. Then let's ask ourselves, well, what do we learn from that? And now let's improve our processes so that our new improved process reduces the chance of making that same mistake again. We've got a completely different environment. We now have a learning environment where we're not afraid of mistakes. We fix them and we learn from them. That's a completely different environment than one in which everybody's afraid to do anything because they don't want to get yelled at or screamed at or blamed. So just that simple fundamental has enormous influence in an organization for managers and line employees alike.
Increasingly, a lot of employees are looking to work for companies that stand for more than profit, that have a triple bottom line approach, whatever you'd like to call it, mission driven. And often, that can only happen when the culture embodies those values as well. I know that's different for every company, but it's a general sort of truism. But we're seeing studies that show employees will look at a company's culture and value it even more than salary. This is meaningful, and all indicators are it's only going to increase as younger generations continue to occupy the workforce. But from your own experience, how have you seen this come? How is this playing out and what you're seeing out there? What should companies be doing to leverage it as maybe a strategic advantage? How do you bring those two things together, mission, culture, and what the world sees about your company?
The biggest reason that employees will come to a company and or stay with a company is if they feel connected to, engaged with, aligned with that company's culture. And to your point, they will leave a company when they don't feel aligned, and they'll stay with a company even for less money when they do feel aligned with that. And that's obviously not an excuse to pay people less, but money is not the number one driver. They need to feel like they're being fairly compensated, but it's not about money. It's about feeling like I'm aligned with this company and I'm a part of something bigger than myself. That people want to feel that I'm a part of something larger, that we're doing something meaningful here. And I think you're right as well, that that's only happening more because while I think that's always been true, it's even more true in the younger generation that's entering the workforce. That quality of life, being part of something bigger is important to them. So to your question, to the extent that we can articulate what that culture is more clearly and give evidence for who we are and what we're about and what we practice, we become a lot more attractive to those people that want that. So the more clear and systematic we are about our culture, the more authentic it is to those who are considering coming and joining us. And the more clear they are as well about what that company's culture is. Because maybe it isn't even so much good or bad culture, is that a culture that aligns with me? So even if maybe you're really clear about your culture, and I look at that and say, you know what, I get that's what you're about, but that's not what I'm about, and so fine, I'm not a good fit for your culture.
You've written that most CEOs you encounter say culture is really important, but they seldom have a concrete plan for optimizing their cultures. And from our experience at the Returns On Wellbeing Institute, while HR often gets or understands the importance of culture, they have a hard time convincing their CEOs and their C-suites to provide the resources and leadership to make the necessary fundamental change. There's a big disconnect here. And I have heard time after time after time, we can't reach the CEO. You've talked to thousands of CEOs about this. So tell us, if the benefits are this clear, why aren't more CEOs getting it? And how does HR get more CEOs focused?
Yes.
What would you advise HR to do in this situation?
Yeah. So let me frame that first by saying, Jim, that in my experience, the single most important factor in the success of a culture initiative is what I would call CEO sponsorship. If the CEO isn't on board, we're not going very far. So to your point, so let's look at one, why are some of these CEOs not on board, and two, what can HR do about it? So with regard to why some CEOs or many CEOs aren't on board with it, while they recognize that culture is important, I think the single biggest reason is they don't see a method. As long as culture is fluffy, if I'm a CEO, I don't know what to, yes, I know it's important, but it's squishy, it's fluffy, I can't measure it, it's not concrete. If I went to business school, I learned all about finances and operations and marketing, and I can measure all that stuff, and we can set goals and targets, and I can talk about that stuff all day long. It's not that I don't think it's important, I think it's really important, I just don't know what to do about it. So I think that's their challenge. That ties very directly to, from the HR perspective, if the HR leader is going to the CEO and talking about it in soft, fluffy terms, that's not what the CEO is listening for or wants to hear. The CEO wants to hear, one, that it's a financial and strategic issue. It's not an HR issue. It's a financial and strategic issue. Secondly, the CEO wants to know, tell me what the plan is. How do I do it? Give me something I can say yes to that's a specific plan. And it's not, let's have pizza every Friday, or it's not, let's have dress down days on Thursdays. That's not culture, and the CEO doesn't want to hear about that stuff. He or she wants to hear about a concrete, specific plan for how this is going to help us make more money and be more strategically successful. And that's where the HR person needs to go.
Stress, anxiety, depression, off the charts. We've been studying it for some time before COVID, and it was very disturbingly high before COVID came along, and then COVID has only exacerbated that. But a lot of that stress before, and I don't think it's changed dramatically now, is job-related. And studies show that work can be actually very good for mental health, or it can be detrimental, depending on, I'd say, the culture. Other things, of course, but the culture. The World Health Organization basically says that negative working environments can lead to physical, mental health problems, substance abuse, alcoholism, absenteeism, lost productivity. So we've got that starting point. If you could think of any concrete takeaways for listeners to really look at culture, mental health. We talk a lot about destigmatizing, talking about it and recognizing it is just as important as, or maybe even precludes, good physical health. But any insights on that?
A big part of mental health as it relates to the workplace is an employee feeling, one, that two, that they have friends at work, and three, that they feel appreciated and recognized. And I think when they don't feel those things, it contributes to a sense of isolation, of hopelessness, of stress. And so if we can create an environment where people feel connected to each other, I like going to work because those are my friends and we care about each other and we feel we support each other. And I know that, I'm not afraid, again, go back to blameless problem solving. I'm not afraid to make a mistake. I mean, think about the stress that comes from, I'm afraid to make a mistake because I might lose my job, or I might get screamed at, or I might be ridiculed, or I might be embarrassed. That's tremendous emotional toll that kind of stuff takes. And think of the opposite. I come into a workplace where, I'm empowered to be the best that I can be. I feel appreciated and recognized. I feel supported. I feel like we work together as a team. I know that people have my back. I'm encouraged to try new things and expand myself. I'm encouraged to be a learner and to grow my skill set. What a difference in mental health those two places would be.
COVID has changed the workplace enormously. Many employees now work remotely, and that's going to continue for quite a while. From your standpoint and what you do, what implications does that have for workplace culture?
Yeah, it's interesting. So first thing I would say, Jim, is that as I look at across our clients and people we talk to, first thing I would say is that those companies that prior to COVID had invested heavily in building strong cultures are thriving through this period. Mm-hmm. Those companies that didn't are struggling mightily. And the reason for that is it goes back to what I said earlier, that if your culture was mostly a function of physical presence, I was around key people and I saw their example, and that was really the only or the primary way in which I was driving culture. Well, now with everybody working remotely, we're not seeing each other. And so I don't have the chance to let the good stuff from your leadership, rub off on me by mere proximity to you. So I don't have that anymore. And so it becomes more important than it's ever been to have a systematic way to build the structure, to build the wiring, and to put the wiring in place such that the culture is a daily present part of our lives and isn't dependent upon physical proximity. And that's where the systematic nature of what I teach becomes so critical. It's become more critical than it's ever been before because of people no longer being together.
So your systematic method is your ritualization, I take it, right?
Yes. It's all of the 8-step framework, but the core of it is define the behaviors that drive success in the company in really clear terms, and then create this structured, systematic way through rituals to teach those behaviors over and over and over and over and over and over and again. We do that, and that stuff's going to start to become internalized and change the way people operate.
All right. Well, David, thank you very much. This was terrific. We've enjoyed talking with you, and wish you all the success in the world. It sounds like you are doing what makes you thrive, and that is good.
I am. Thanks, Jim and Stephen. Great to be with you.
Thank you.